Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Awesome. This is going to be a great colloquium. So welcome to the Future of Internet Governance and Conflict. This is the second Carnegie colloquium that we've had, where the goal of these colloquiums is really to start a conversation about issues that we feel are of international prominence, that focus where technology and policy really collide. And I use that word collide because often they're in violent opposition to start with, and we have to find a middle ground. So the point of these colloquiums is to start this conversation about where should we be going as a society. About a month ago in October, we had our first colloquium, and it was hosted in Washington, D.C. at the Carnegie Endowment of International Peace, our colleagues in running these colloquiums, where we explored the issues of privacy and autonomous weapons systems. It was a great conversation, very well attended, and we had a lot of interesting, thought-provoking pieces in the news media written up afterwards. So hopefully you'll find this colloquium just as exciting. My name is David Brumley. I'm going to be the MC today. I'm a professor here at Carnegie Mellon and the director of SciLab. I'm the co-host of this with Tim Maurer. Tim, can you stand up? So Tim and I have worked together to invite our distinguished panelists here to open this discussion and really drive it forward. So thank you, Tim, for all your work. I'd like to now, at this time, invite Subra Suresh, the president of Carnegie Mellon, to say a few words about this colloquium and the importance of the international discussion on these issues. Thank you. Subra.
Thank you, Dave. Let me offer my welcome to all of you for this important colloquium. The collaborative effort of our two organizations, Carnegie Mellon University and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, is very critical to us for a variety of reasons, especially at this point in time where technology has so many implications for society in ways in which we know and in ways in which we have absolutely no clue at this point. And that's why it's very important that we have this conversation here. Let me start by thanking Ambassador Bill Burns for his role in this event. I've had the great personal pleasure and privilege of knowing Bill for a little more than a year now. We first met at Carnegie Corporation in New York, and we've had the opportunity to interact on a few occasions. As two organizations that reflect the strong legacy of Andrew Carnegie, Carnegie Mellon University and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace have formed a powerful partnership to examine technology and diplomacy across a set of emerging areas of critical importance to the future. It's my sincere hope that this event, together with the inaugural event that was just held a few weeks ago in Washington, form the basis for an even closer relationship between our two institutions. We would also like to thank the Carnegie Corporation of New York, and especially its president, Dr. Vartan Gregorian, for his support of both of these colloquia, his vision in further fostering and strengthening the collaborations among all of the Carnegie family organizations, of which there are about 21 or so. And we have the pleasure of meeting periodically, at least once every 2 years, in different venues around the world, and we'll be meeting again in 2017. To understand Carnegie Mellon University's role in artificial intelligence, machine learning, and cybersecurity, we must recognize two things, which many of you know. First, we must acknowledge that the traditional national security paradigm of protecting air, land, and sea must now inevitably include a fourth realm, cyberspace. Second, no institution is better positioned to cultivate, navigate through, and defend this new world than the birthplace of many of the ingredients that feed into cybersecurity. Areas such as computer science, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity. And Carnegie Mellon is that institution with a rich background that has played a pioneering role in so many ways. Ever since Herbert Simon and Alan Novell pioneered artificial intelligence, going as far back as the 1950s, CMU has been at the cutting edge of this work. Carnegie Mellon took a bold step a generation later to create its Software Engineering Institute, or SEI, which has served the nation through the Department of Defense and industry by acquiring, developing, and sustaining innovative software systems that are affordable, enduring, and trustworthy. Designing safe software systems and attempting to recreate the learning abilities of the human brain were natural progressions toward two of the modern world's most pressing concerns, cybersecurity and privacy. So to meet this challenge, Carnegie Mellon cybersecurity and privacy research is multidisciplinary and very broadly encompassing. In fact, many of my colleagues would say it's all-encompassing, incorporating faculty from across the university with strengths in areas such as policy development, risk management, and modeling. CMU likely has more key players in this field on the world stage than perhaps any other single academic institution. And we are expanding our expertise to help secure the vast and growing Internet of Things, to pioneer cyber autonomy, and to improve and expand education to train cybersecurity experts for our immediate needs and for decades to come. Our aim is to develop a new generation of technologies that deliver a quantifiable computer security and sustainable communication systems, and the policy guidelines to maximize their effectiveness. CMU's premier research center on the subject is Scilab on campus, and Dave Brumley, our moderator, is an MC, is the director of that lab. It's a visionary public-private partnership that has become a world leader in technological research, education, and security awareness among cyber citizens of all ages. By drawing expertise of more than 100 CMU faculty from various disciplines, Scilab maintains its place as a world leader in the technical development of AI, cyber offense and defense, and is a pipeline for public and private sector leadership in organizations as varied as the National Security Agency and Google. And we put Scilab and our work in this area front and center at the colloquium in Washington. We brought Scilab Professor Mario Savides to give a presentation of his facial recognition software. Featured in a 60 Minutes report on machine learning, Professor Savides' facial recognition programming helped match a blurry surveillance photo with the Boston Marathon bomber from a database of 1 million faces. Also, as you probably saw just a few weeks ago, we had Andrew Moore, the dean of our School of Computer Science, was featured in the 60 Minutes program on the future of artificial intelligence. Andrew was just in Washington a couple of days ago to testify to the Senate on the promise and peril of artificial intelligence. Our MC today, David Brumley, the director of Carnegie Mellon Scilab, who led a CMU team just a few months ago that won this year's Super Bowl of hacking, DARPA's $2 million Cyber Grand Challenge. And another group led by Professor Brumley also won the DEF CON hackathon contest in Las Vegas just a week later. CMU's preeminence in artificial intelligence and cybersecurity is aided in no small part by the partnership between the university and a number of organizations, and we are very grateful to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace for partnering with that. And I want to thank Bill for his leadership, his enormous leadership that also brings his vast experience as a diplomat to many of the policy conversations that we are having as in the context of technology and cybersecurity. I just want to close with two, three things that are on my mind related to this topic. Just about 3 weeks ago, CMU announced a major gift from K&L Gates, a law firm, a global law firm headquartered in Pittsburgh, which will endow professorships and student fellowships to study ethics and artificial intelligence. And one of the reasons, as Pete Kalis, the previous managing partner of K&L Gates, articulated, they chose Carnegie Mellon University because of the unique combination of expertise right at the intersection of not only the cutting edge of technology, but how the technology impacts humanity. And ethics is very much at the core of how we as humans not only will use technology intentionally, but how we are likely to abuse it, either intentionally or unintentionally. And this is one of those areas where we have a number of colleagues on campus studying from humanities and social sciences to Heinz College of Public Policy and Management to engineering and public policy, studying various aspects of this intersection. The second point I want to make related to this is, as you know, the World Economic Forum earlier this year had a theme in January of 2016, the Fourth Industrial Revolution. The Fourth Industrial Revolution is the convergence of the physical world, the cyber world, and the biological world. And many believe that we are in the very early phases of that Fourth Industrial Revolution that will define the evolution of the 21st century in ways in which we cannot fully imagine or comprehend at this point in time. And how we succeed in that convergence as a human race will inevitably depend on how we connect technology to humanity. And the World Economic Forum has also created a number of what they call future councils, which will be meeting in Davos next month to talk about not only efforts, but policy actions involving governments from developing and developed countries to focus on many different areas of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. I'm really delighted to report that there are many colleagues and faculty members from Carnegie Mellon University who are leading efforts as part of the future councils of the World Economic Forum, who will be traveling with me to Davos next month. And the World Economic Forum will put out a report in the summer of 2018 that will have specific recommendations for various governments. In fact, just the Future Council on Production alone has ministers from 28 different countries, including many developing countries, to talk about what is the role of artificial intelligence in the future of production, job opportunities, labor unions, etc. So this is a very important conversation, and symposia such as the one that we are having today are so critical to developing an understanding of the key factors that will have an impact on a global scale in these kinds of events that are scheduled to happen even in the next few years. So let me close by expressing my gratitude on behalf of all of my colleagues at Carnegie Mellon for this partnership with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Together, we are establishing a very strong foundation for future colloquia that will help better inform thinking on technology and diplomacy in these critical areas. I would also like to extend a special note of thanks to all of our panelists who have taken time from their busy schedules to be here, and to Mr. Malcolm Johnson, who will give a keynote. He is the Deputy Executive Secretary from the International Telecommunications Union in Geneva. Thank you so much for traveling here. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Ambassador Bill Burns. And I can say he needs no introduction, but deserves a lot of introduction. I won't take time to say it other than to say that his impact on diplomacy, his impact on policy, and his impact on the State Department are profound. And I'm really delighted to call him a colleague and a friend and a member of the Carnegie family. Bill, welcome.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Subra, for that very kind introduction. I really am deeply grateful to you and all of your colleagues for this partnership and for your warm hospitality today. I am delighted to be here at Carnegie Mellon, one of the world's premier universities and a fellow member of the impressive group of institutions founded by Andrew Carnegie more than a century ago. I also want to thank Tim Maurer and Dave Brumley for bringing our two institutions together for this colloquium series and for all their imagination and hard work in pulling it off. We were honored to host the first part of the colloquium just over a month ago at the Carnegie Endowment in Washington. The topic was artificial intelligence and its implications in the civilian and military domains. I found the conversations between some of the very best technical and policy minds from around the world to be fascinating, informative, inspiring, and if I'm honest, more than a little bit intimidating. The same could be said for my introductory meeting with Carnegie Mellon's remarkable SnakeBot, BallBot, and their robotic friends. Our focus today is on the future of conflict and governance in the cyber domain. In half a century, the world, as all of you know very well, has gone from 0 digitally connected devices to more than 4 billion. And 1/3 of the world's population is now on the internet. Another 2 to 3 billion people will come online in the next 3 years, marking what will be the fastest period of internet adoption in history. The internet has become a critical lifeblood for economies and societies, and in turn, an increasingly contested and volatile global common. Advanced economies lose billions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of jobs a year as a result of malicious cyber activity, while nearly half of all internet users around the world are chained by government restrictions on internet content, access, and communication. So we're in a race against time to develop the rules and norms that will allow us to maximize the benefits of the digital age while minimizing its risks. This is the animating purpose of the Carnegie Endowment Cyber Policy Initiative, working quietly with government officials, experts, and businesses in key countries. Our team is trying to develop norms and measures to manage the cyber threats of greatest strategic significance. These include threats to the integrity of financial data, unresolved tensions between governments and private actors regarding how to actively defend against cyber attack, systemic corruption of the information and communication technology supply chain, and attacks on command and control of strategic weapon systems. Our partnership with Carnegie Mellon seeks to deepen the exchange of ideas among our scholars and the global community of technical experts and practitioners wrestling with this challenge. Our hope is that this conversation will be the beginning of a sustained collaboration between our two institutions and with all of you. There is simply too much at stake for all of us to tackle this problem separately. We can, indeed we must, tackle it together. I'd also like to conclude, as Subra did, by thanking Vartan Gregorian and the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their encouragement and for making this colloquium possible. So with that characteristically long-winded introduction from a recovering diplomat behind us, let me thank all of you again for being here this morning and turn the proceedings over to David. Thank you very much again.
All right, everybody. I want to run real quick through what you can expect today. We're going to start off with a first panel on cyber deterrence. After that, we're going to have a short break and go on to our second panel on the future of the internet in the post-transition world. We'll then have lunch, and then we'll have our keynote. Now, this colloquium is being live broadcast on Facebook. And so there's another set of people who are going to be watching this, and we will be taking questions potentially from the internet. So if you're online and have a question, please post it to Facebook. We have someone monitoring, and we'll ask the panelists. So the first thing in the agenda as part of this panel is we wanted to set the stage for the audience about what the topic is and why we think it's important. To give you some background on why we think that this is the sort of thing that really deserves an international discussion. So the first panel is on cyber deterrence, and my job for the next 10 minutes is to give this overview for you. At the heart of the issue is whether or not a nation can deter enemies from using cyber attacks. Now, not all attacks are equal, of course. We see attacks every day, and a lot of them are actually somewhat pedestrian. Someone breaks into someone else's computers. Now, those are important. We shouldn't diminish the importance of it. But some attacks are much more serious, and those tend to be the focal point for the deterrence question. In particular, people say things like, for example, someone could turn off the US power grid, or someone could take over a nuclear reactor, or take over a warship, or cause severe economic damage. These are the sorts of attacks that we wonder, is there a way to deter them from ever happening? Now, some would go as far as saying that cyberspace weapons are as significant as nuclear weapons. I mean, if you think about it, this is a pretty bold statement, but it was said by General Feng of the People's Liberation Army in China in 2013 that if the internet security cannot be controlled, it's not an exaggeration to say the effects could be no less than a nuclear bomb. Can you believe that? He's saying it's not even an exaggeration, that it's as much as a nuclear bomb. Now, with that in our mind, a natural question is, when we deter these, where can we look for theories on how deterrence would work? And of course, one of the things that comes immediately to mind is nuclear deterrence theories. Since the first atomic bomb, the question has been, why don't we just bomb the enemy? And part of deterrence is, well, of course, because they're going to bomb us back, and that leads to complete and total annihilation. And this has kept the world from using nuclear weapons past those very first incidents in World War II. Now, this strategy has a name. It's called MAD, Mutually Assured Direct Destruction. And this acronym comes from actually a computer scientist, mathematician, a guy who invented game theory called Johnny van Neumann. And Johnny van Neumann really loved these kind of punny names when he came up with MAD. He also came up with one called Maniac for his first computer. So he's kind of a character. But he was instrumental in forming this theory. And it's actually backed not just by policy, but backed by a lot of science. It's what's called a Nash equilibrium, where the mathematics says once armed, neither side has any incentive to initiate a conflict or to disarm. So we have the policy and we have the science backing up this theory. Now, we know nuclear deterrence works. You can just look. The fact that we're all here today, despite many countries having nuclear weapons, is a great testament to that. Proponents of cyber deterrence often invoke analogies to things like MAD as models of how to think about cyberspace. In fact, the Cold War cyber deterrence strategy seems part of the 2015 US Department of Defense cyber strategy. But we need to dig a little bit deeper into the issue to see, does this analogy really hold? I mean, we don't want to run into a fallacy where we're trying to reason by analogy, but the analogy doesn't hold because we can reach incorrect conclusions. And so there's a differing viewpoint that says this analogy makes no sense. And part of what we're trying to do in this colloquium is unravel this a little further. So I was reading a work by a gentleman named Patrick Sorense from Stanford University, and he lays out why cyber deterrence isn't the same as nuclear in his opinion. And he points out 3 reasons. First, strategic cyber weapons don't seem to share the same sheer destructive power of a nuclear weapon. Nuclear weapons blast through reinforced concrete. Cyber weapons don't. Second, nuclear weapons have an assuredness of destruction. Both sides know that they're going to suffer complete and total annihilation. Else one side could reason, hey, if I could attack the other side and I could live through it, then maybe, from the game theory, I should do that first. Cyber weapons tend to not have this reassurance. And third, this is where policy comes into play. It's that everyone knows everyone's policy is immediate retaliation if they detect a nuclear attack. If this policy wasn't well known, the theory wouldn't work out. Everyone has to believe everyone else is willing to carry out an attack. There can't be ifs, ands, or buts. So with cyber, it's a complicated story. Cyber never has the same immediate destructive power. We don't have the same well-known policies, and we lack this notion of mutually assured destruction. We also know that cyber doesn't just depend upon retaliation in the cyber domain, and this is key. This is something people forget about sometimes, where if someone attacks me with a cyber weapon, the US has an entire arsenal that involves kinetic weapons as well that could be used as part of a response. And so there's more interesting dynamics in this sort of reasoning. For example, President Obama has stated that he would be ready to use kinetic weapons, bombs, in response to a serious cyber attack that posed a serious public risk. Cyber weapons are also different. So when you start thinking about the strategy, as President Suresh mentioned, we have air, land, space, and sea, which are well-defined domains, but cyber is the first man-made domain. And that makes all the difference. We don't have immutable laws of physics in the cyber domain. So if, for example, deterrence is relying on this idea of exploits against computer vulnerabilities, where a vulnerability is a flaw in software, does it matter which side has the fewest vulnerabilities? And since these are man-made creations, should we be focusing on having fewer vulnerabilities? And could that even lead to thinking that we are now superior and we could attack someone else without fear of retribution? Cyberspace is also virtual. One of the things that my team does in DEF CON when we play these games is we steal other people's attacks. And what enables us to do this is in the cyber domain, stealing a weapon is as easy as copying an MP3. Now, in the kinetic domain with bombs, when you launch a bomb, they're destroyed. And it takes manufacturing capabilities to build them and so on. So even if I handed someone the schematics to a bomb, it would take a long time for them to build it. But in cyber, it's different. It's just bits on a wire, and we can steal them. And if someone attacks me, I can steal those bits and use them to attack someone else. So the question we're here to really unravel is what, if any kind, of deterrence can we expect out of cyber? Does this make sense? What are the technical features of cyber that make deterrence potentially better or potentially worse? And what are the policy measures, such as this notion in MAD where things have to be very public, that need to be in place for deterrence to be as effective? So that's really the stage as I see it, and this is why we're interested in exploring this from both a technical and policy perspective. With that, I'd like to introduce our panelists and moderators to continue looking into this question. So first, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Nicole Perlroth. Can you join me on stage? Welcome, Nicole. So Ms. Perlroth covers cybersecurity and privacy for the New York Times. Her 2014 Times profile of a security blogger has covered things such as the Brian Krebs attack, and has been optioned by Sony Pictures. Prior to joining the Times in 2011, Mrs. Perlroth covered venture capital and startups for Forbes magazine. We think it's really important to involve the news media in these sort of discussions because they can give us an interesting perspective of where they think the public should be hearing messages and what sort of questions they have on behalf of the public. Our first panelist is Ariel Eli Levite, who is a senior fellow at the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Eli, can you please join me on stage? Prior to joining the Carnegie Endowment in 2008, Mr. Levite was the Principal Deputy Director of General for Policy at the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission from 2002 to 2007. He also served as the Deputy National Security Advisor for Defense Policy and was head of the Bureau of International Security and Arms Control in the Israeli Ministry of Defense. Our next panelist is Lieutenant General Robert Schmidl, retired. Can you please join me on stage? So General Schmidl has a long and distinguished career, as you can imagine. Thank you for your service, General. General Schmidl was selected to be the first deputy commander for the United States Cyber Command. So again, we're getting to this idea of land, air, space, and sea. When the US set up Cyber Command, they were recognizing this as a domain that needed a commander at the same sort of level. And I say sort of because it's a sub-unified command and some details such as that. But it demonstrates the importance to the US. So in his role, he planned and conducted all cyberspace operations across the Department of Defense. A pretty important role. He also has extensive flying experience, amassing over 4,700 hours in tactical fighters, primarily in the F-4, F-18, and most recently, the F-5 aircraft. He's also a graduate of the Naval Fighter Weapons School, which most of us know as Top Gun. So not only did he run all cyberspace operations, the man can fly. I know. Currently, General Schmidl serves on the advisory board for Endgame and a few other companies. Finally, I'd like to welcome up Chris Valasek. Chris, can you join us? Chris. So Chris is a Pittsburgh native, a proud Pittsburgh native, and usually when I see him, he's wearing a shirt that says 412 on it. So we all get that joke here. Some people don't. You dressed up today. So Chris is the security lead at Uber, Advanced Technology Center here in Pittsburgh. So here in Pittsburgh, it's fairly common for us to see autonomous vehicles, but every time people from out of town come and start talking about the future's autonomous vehicles, we're like, when we go to a Steelers game, we can get an Uber that takes us back home that's autonomous today. So Chris is extremely well known as a technical leader in cybersecurity. especially for his work in automotive security. Most recently, Chris was lauded for a remote compromise of the 2014 Jeep Cherokee. So if you're driving a Jeep Cherokee, this guy can disable the brakes remotely. Whereby his research partner, Charlie Miller, obtained physical control of this vehicle and demonstrated these sort of vulnerabilities. And it's important to mention that they were demonstrating these sort of vulnerabilities in order to raise the issue that these are things that need to be fixed, because they did it in a very controlled, well-defined environment, and there was a responsible disclosure policy. So Chris specialized in reverse engineering, exploitation, and a number of different computer security expertise. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to the moderator, Ms. Pearl Roth. And please, I turn the program over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Well, I just want to say thank you to Carnegie Mellon and the Carnegie Endowment for having us. And this is a pretty esteemed group of panelists. So thank you for having someone from the failing New York Times here today to moderate. We're here to talk about cyber deterrence. And, I put myself in the camp of people who don't think that nuclear deterrence theory applies so neatly in the cyber realm. For one, cyber weapons are not nuclear weapons. I could sit here and tell you all the secrets relative to nuclear weapons, but you would still have to go out and produce the fissile material. Cyber weapons do not require fissile material to work. They simply require vulnerabilities in code. That could be a misplaced 1 or 0, a poorly chosen password, a clumsy engineering mistake to get into a system, and a way to exploit those vulnerabilities for some kind of destruction. In cyber, the barrier to entry is also much lower. All it takes is someone with $2,000 to buy a laptop, and it's only getting easier. Also, the potential for escalation is much swifter. Our stockpile of cyber weapons here in the United States has hardly kept our adversaries from trying to acquire their own cyber weapons. Dozens of countries, if not more than that, are now stockpiling their own cyber weapons for a rainy day. And not all of these countries are our allies. In fact, increasingly, it's our adversaries in North Korea and Iran that see cyber as a way to level the playing field, particularly as the United States puts increasingly more of our transportation, energy, and critical infrastructure systems online, and the consequence of a compromise have significantly gone up. Also, in nuclear, pinpointing who launched an atomic bomb is a relatively minor thing. In cyberspace, the forensics are not always so straightforward. Cyber weapons are routinely routed through decoy servers around the globe, and tracking their origins can sometimes take months, in some cases years, and in many cases, the detonators are never caught. Nuclear analogies, as David pointed out, also ignore the fact that cyber weapons can be easily hacked, shared, dissected, devoured by our adversaries, and ultimately retrofitted and used against us. In cyber, they say the enemy can be a very good teacher. Iran was able to tease apart many of the cyber weapons used on its own oil and nuclear facilities, and several years later, they used a retrofitted variation of one of those tools, if you believe US government officials, to attack Saudi Aramco, the world's biggest oil company. And then just this week, they used those same tools to attack Saudi aviation systems. And later, North Korea used similar tools to wipe out Sony Pictures computers. So every computer virus, every worm, every piece of malware, payload, backdoor, even the most sophisticated cyber weapons on Earth, once discovered, can be teased apart, reverse engineered bit by bit down to their most fundamental parts. And then with time and patience and skill and the right resources, they could be built back up and turned against us. As President Suresh mentioned, the stakes are also only getting higher with this tidal wave known as the Internet of Things. Very soon, if not already, as Chris can tell us, your car will talk to the internet. The same is true for your home and your refrigerator, your stove, your baby monitor, your pacemaker, your insulin pump, your body. And perhaps nation states or cyber terrorists have not started searching or buying ways to hack into these systems yet, but they will very soon. So it was exactly 40 years ago that humans dispatched the first message over the internet. Now imagine what the internet will look like in another 10 years, another 20 years, another 40 years. Think how much more dependent we will become on this platform and how many more of our critical infrastructure systems will migrate online. And now think about the potential for destruction. So only when we have highly visible mishaps, perhaps, will these rules be created. We're right in the middle of the creation of this regime. The rules for the Wassenaar Treaty are being rewritten as we speak, but we have the added challenge of writing rules for a world that's not international, but transnational, with nation states and private actors, each with enormous power. And the lines between which tools apply to offense and which tools apply to defense are not so clear. And finally, increasingly with our global supply chain, we can't ensure that the most fundamental parts of our technology infrastructure, the microchips, encryption chips, et cetera, have not been altered in some way to ensure that foreign intelligence services can gain access to our infrastructure. With nuclear deterrence, this theory sort of arose when we were locked in a Cold War with two players. But in cyber, the picture is much more complicated. In China and Russia, for example, they rely, at least in part, on proxies, private actors that act at the direction of the state for government purposes. And proxies provide them with a feeble degree of plausible deniability. In Russia, cyber criminals are mainly focused on financial crimes. In China, proxies are engaged in industrial espionage. But both nations provide a degree of training and support to their proxies, and they insist on one cardinal rule, which is no hacking against the motherland. Russian proxies were responsible for some of the attacks on Estonia and Georgia. Chinese proxies have been responsible for exfiltrating nuclear propulsion technologies, some of our most valuable intellectual property here in the United States. In the US, we don't rely on proxies to engage in state-sponsored cyber attacks, and we don't engage in industrial espionage to gain an economic advantage. So there's less plausible deniability for us, save for the fact that at the time being, and some of my panelists may disagree with this, we're just still the best and better at hiding our tracks. So there's a lot to unpack here, and without further ado, I'd like to move the discussion to our panelists, who will go down and each of our panelists will give some remarks on their thoughts on cyber deterrence. I'll ask some questions, and then we're going to actually give you all the opportunity to ask some questions. So if you have a question, just raise your hand, and someone will be there to bring a microphone over. The old-fashioned way, yeah. So, Ellie, why don't you go ahead?
Good morning. I'm thrilled to be here, and I think this interaction between technology and policy and between the two institutions is really a great opportunity to discuss some of those issues. In my effort to try and unpack the question in front of us, I basically disaggregate it into three questions. Can we deter cyber attacks? Can cyber be used to deter other types of attacks? And is cyber a desirable deterrence tool? And in what applications does it actually maximize its value? So my answer to these questions, clear as they may have sounded, is it all depends, perhaps and maybe. It's very difficult to offer a generic and general sort of answer, which I think would not leave you hugely more informed, let alone give you a manual on how to do it. But let me explain why and still walk you forward to try and say something concrete. First of all, as we all understand, this is a relatively new field, and we're still a learning process. There are so many newer players, and the dynamics is changing. There is high volatility. Little seems to be fixed or permanent, and so on. Just talk to the insurance people trying to get a grasp of what the threats are and what they would look in, and so on. And there's so many players, motivations, capabilities, scenarios, so the picture is quite complex, and so on. And we have a very highly imperfect information base, certainly in the public domain, but even in sort of in the government circles, the information you have is partial, incomplete, inaccurate, and in some cases even biased. So it's very difficult to offer anything other than a speculation, and what I will try to share with you is some informed speculation. I think that a good starting point for the discussion is what actual cyber threats we wish to deter. It was very clear in the nuclear domain. It's a lot more complicated question to answer in the cyber domain. And even more importantly, how successful we're dealing with them using other means, and so where should deterrence come in as distinguished, for example. In the nuclear, we ultimately ended up putting a lot of emphasis on deterrence because defense did not seem to be like a very palatable option. Is that the same case in cyber? Just to give you one indication. So the threats we may wish to deter, the ones that have already been mentioned by David Bramley earlier, was the destruction of physical infrastructure and other very sensitive assets. Interestingly enough, notwithstanding the huge hype about it, for the moment at least, it looks like that threat does not really materialize. And we're not confident that it's actually deterrence that is doing the trick. And we actually need to understand that better. So while we should remain concerned about that, I'm not entirely convinced that that's where deterrence is actually required as something more than is self-evidence, and in any event, we need to invest heavily in resiliency and things of that nature. I think that the biggest challenge in front of us is to prevent encroachment on confidentiality and making it public. We're doing very poorly, both on encroachment on confidentiality and on making it public, in part because we want to make the world safe for intelligence, for homeland security, and so on. Everyone, in certain states, very safe for the regime, so they want to penetrate everything and everywhere. I think that disruption is a problem, although overall, what we have learned over time seems to suggest that disruptions are a nuisance rather than a strategic threat. Undermining integrity, in my judgment, integrity of data, is the number one challenge in front of us in the future, and the question is whether deterrence can actually play a role in preventing sort of undermining the trust or even casting doubt about the integrity. I think that the next challenge in terms of importance, and we've come to appreciate it in the past couple of months, and I think looking ahead will be an even bigger challenge, even in 2017, is disseminating fake or deliberately distorted information and making use of it. So my message is the two things that I think we're not there and we would need to focus on is deterring undermining of the integrity and disseminating fake or deliberately distorted information. And I think that what Ambassador Burns mentioned earlier, that our norm effort is designed to actually empower deterrence in both of these domains, as creating a basis for making other people think twice, but also giving you the legitimacy to retaliate if the need arises. A second issue to consider is that what we're actually seeing in the cyber domain is the movement of a lot of human activity that took place in other domains previously, and therefore is becoming very difficult because we're trying to deal with crime, we're trying to deal with enthusiasm, ideological enthusiasm, we're trying to deal with anarchism, but we're also trying to deal with security threats. So basically saying, how can we deter everything that we've done in the physical space? Now in the cyberspace, obviously clouds things a great deal. But anyone who wants to think concretely now has to figure out an answer to the following questions, and I'll try to very quickly walk you through the questions and answers. Can we clearly delineate what activity we wish to deter? I am suggesting that we should have a very clear eye of what we should really put the most emphasis on, and I've laid it out and so on. One thing that we clearly are not trying to deter is espionage. Shocking, but on balance, most people do not want to deter espionage. Second is, will you know when the activity you're trying to deter occurs? I think one of the biggest differences with the nuclear is, do you really know? Do you know it reliably? Do you know when it's do you know it in a timely basis and so on? I think we're getting better at that, but so the answer is certainly not immediately and not reliably, and furthermore, in many of those cases, it's not based on forensics. So it's very difficult to use that as a basis for deterrence. We need to figure out whether it's an innocent accident or it's actually an attack, who it's coming from, and who is actually behind the person who would actually, or persons who would actually perform that. So that's a complication. Can we, and I think that from a deterrence point of view is, do we have the legitimacy to retaliate that we can actually make public? And that is, so even if you know reliably, often you can't use it. So that's a complicating factor. Okay, do we possess the means to retaliate that are cheap? In cyber, probably yes. Reliable? The answer is less confident. Not bad, but less confident. Surgically, we're least confident about. And even if the answer exists today, it may not exist in 3 months' time because of routine security measures or just maintenance issues. So, not clear. Is the other side vulnerable to retaliation? But is he, the answer is probably yes. Probably everybody, even North Korea may be on the margins vulnerable. But can he retaliate? Can the other side retaliate? A big question. And the biggest question, I think, that we need to walk through is whether under these circumstances one is splitting off attacks, most of the attacks, as the acceptable cost of doing business, as we do with credit cards, for example, and so on, as something that should be dealt with through resilience and normal security measures and so on. Where does deterrence actually fit in? So my bottom line to try and wrap up is the following. Cyber has proven to be a potent tool for signaling intent in the service of both deterrence and coercive diplomacy. When applied against very high-level and very specific threats, against Iran's nuclear program, by Iran against the United States banking system and critical infrastructure, by Russia against the Ukrainian power grid, and so on. So in those narrow circumstances, I think cyber is a very potent tool of both deterrence and coercive diplomacy. And there have been significant successes. The track record of deterring cyber attacks has proven less inspiring. Where it succeeded, it has required tools that go well beyond cyber. I don't wish to belittle cyber, but it required tools well beyond cyber, so whole of government responses and so on. And I think the last issue is that even in cases where we think that it's deterrence that has delivered the results, we're not entirely confident because maybe the uncertainty about the effects of employing cyber tools is actually the thing that is dissuading, self-deterring countries from engaging it, which is not a bad outcome at the end of the day. Thank you.
Thanks, Sally. Bob?
Okay, well, good morning, and like everyone else has said, I'm delighted to be here. You know, I retired in July, and since then I've been hanging around and been around folks in the world of cybersecurity, and I am perennially overdressed. I always show up in a suit somewhere. So today I decided that I was going to dress like all of these other folks that I've been dealing with, and I found that I'm still overdressed, so thank you very much. So one of the things that, what I thought I'd do is come at this from a slightly different angle, which is sort of from an operational standpoint, since that's what my background is. And the first thing that I would tell you when we start to think about cyber deterrence is that this is about deterring someone from doing something. And so we ought not to get too wrapped around the axle about the technologies and about the things that we are using to deter, because at the end of the day, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to affect someone's behavior, right? And as the saying goes, the credible capacity to coerce someone is in the eyes of the person that's trying to be coerced. It's not what we think deters people, it's what we know, and it's what we see in the behavior of others that tells us that our deterrence strategy is working. There's a lot of different actors out there, so that's one of the reasons I think that the nuclear analogy begins to break down in some places, because while it has proved to be an extraordinarily effective deterrence vis-a-vis nation states, it has not proven to be an effective deterrence vis-a-vis terrorist groups or others who have a different metric about what risk they're willing to accept in terms of their activities and the potential retaliation for those activities. So I think it's just important that we keep that in mind. This is clearly not going to be a one-size-fits-all. The attribution piece that was touched on earlier is also extraordinarily important because, again, when you think about the effect that Reagan's speech had years ago when he said he was going to start to fund Star Wars, what became Star Wars, the missile defense issue, the shockwaves that sent through the relationships that we had with the Soviet Union was significant because that would now hold at risk, if you will, or would invalidate many of the capabilities that the Soviets had to be able to deliver nuclear weapons against the soil of the United States. So sometimes there's indirect ways that we can go about thinking about, again, affecting the behavior of the adversary. The next thing is when we think about retaliation, which Ellie just talked about, should we be thinking about having some kind of a cyber trustworthy force? Is there a way that we can have a force that is capable of retaliating in a conventional means or in a cyber means that has there's a level of surety, if you will, that we have that force can survive a massive cyber attack, whether it's a denial of service attack or something more sophisticated than that. So again, we keep coming back to this, and I was delighted to hear the comments earlier about this nexus of technology and policy. And there's another piece of that too, and that's psychology, because that's really kind of what this whole thing is, what we're really talking about here. In my experience, the relationship between policy and in some cases law and technology is indeed symbiotic, and in many cases, the people that are in each of those three areas have very little understanding of what is in the other bin. So for example, if you were trying to develop cyber policy that was going to be part of a national security strategy, you would want to have a very deep technical knowledge of the capabilities that you are trying to develop or that you think are employable. We don't have that problem in the kinetic world. And so you've got a number of folks running around in uniform with stars on their shoulders that say, look, I understand that. If I build this weapon system, it will do X, Y, and Z. And there's an immediate context that you set in which you discuss the effects of those weapons, and everybody has a common understanding. In the world of cyber things, it's not necessarily the case. And we tend to go to one of two extremes. We either evolve into geek speak, and you'll be in a room with 10 people, and 2 of them are talking to each other, and the other 8 are nodding knowingly and have absolutely no idea what the hell they're talking about. Or you have a conversation at 50,000 feet that is absolutely fact-free, terribly satisfying, and sounds like an undergraduate seminar, and everybody leaves the room, and you go, oh, okay, I got it. So now where are we going? So just a thought. So I think that the fact that you're looking at this here at CMU from an interdisciplinary perspective is extraordinary, and that is exactly the focus that I think we need to have. David mentioned this AI considerations earlier. So if I look at the kinds of things that we can do in the world of artificial intelligence, and where sort of, in my experience with this, which has been mostly in the world of algorithmic learning agents, decision support aids, if you're going to get to a point where you're thinking about an effect and a reaction to an effect, a cyber effect, you immediately are faced with the issue of time, right? And the fact that what is different about cyber is the near simultaneity of a decision that I make to institute something or to execute something, and the fact that it happens. There's no longer a lag between, okay, I think let's get a bunch of people in a room, we're going to come up with a plan of attack, I'm going to tell everybody to go forward, and then they sally forth and do great things. Not necessarily the case, especially in terms of the reaction to that. And as you all in this room know better, because many of you are computer scientists, that sometimes our ability to defend critical infrastructure networks depends on our ability to be able to begin defensive measures literally immediately. So there's not time for everybody to kind of sit back and think about how we're going to react. So as artificial intelligence, as it becomes more sophisticated vis-a-vis the decision processes that we're making, that we're executing, what I think we need to be thinking about is the decision makers. The people that are ultimately going to be responsible for this have got to be involved at the front end of the development of the algorithms that are going to drive the decisions, that are going to drive the actions that are going to occur. Otherwise, what will happen, I think, is you'll see, whenever you bring up Waze or Google Maps and it tells you you're going someplace and it says, turn right here, and you've been down that street a million times and you wonder why we're turning right, because you don't know what it's using for logic. Is it that it's going to get you there 20 seconds faster and take you through a neighborhood where your life's in danger? Who knows? Or is it because there's a car stalled, or is it because they don't know there's a traffic jam? I don't know that if I'm looking at the map. So if I'm going to start to use learning agents to help me make decisions about how I'm going to react to certain cyber events, I, as the decision maker, as the person ultimately responsible, I have to know much more about what those algorithms were that went in there. And just two last quick points. The issue about disinformation. So that's not new, right? We've been doing this since the beginning of time. We've tried to cause the enemy to think something differently about us. But the scale, scope, and time that we deal with today makes that much, much more of an issue. And when you think about the concept of weaponizing WikiLeaks, for example, which you've kind of seen occur if you look back at over the last couple of years, how is it that you are going to be able to establish any kind of empirical baseline for the truth that's really out there? Number one. Number two, is it ever going to matter? I mean, I don't mean that cynically, but how is it that you think things might ultimately be affected? And the last thing that I would leave you with is this notion of speed. The speed at which things are happening in this domain of cyber, in my opinion, is what makes it really and truly unique. It is a man-made domain, but the speed at which things are occurring and based on the way we've been fighting wars since the beginning of time, speed is the most important thing. But now we have compressed that to the point of near simultaneity, and I don't know that we've really thought our way through that. I mean, Clausewitz would be shaking his head right now trying to figure that out. So I think that there's something to be had there, but it needs to happen at this intersection that we're all about today, which is between the technology and the policy and literally in the psychology of deterrence theory. So thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Chris?
You should have had me as the opening act. I am way outclassed up here. You know, I'm a hacker guy, you know, practitioner of this stuff, and in true computer science fashion, I always want to have my prerequisites well defined before I start this. So everyone talks about deterrence and the repercussions of what would happen if you performed, you know, such an attack. I would take a step back before I even talk about deterrence and say deterrence infers repercussion, right? You don't do something because something bad will happen. There's a reason you go to prison if you kill someone or you're selling drugs, right? Otherwise, it'd be maybe a free-for-all, who knows? That leads me to think that people think about it incorrectly. Who here has found a bug and written an exploit and installed a rootkit? My man. Brumley, I was waiting for you to raise your hand, right? So this is what I did for a living. And deterrence infers repercussions. Repercussions implicitly states that you get caught. If you're really good at writing exploits and rootkits, you don't get caught. Exploits don't go boom, right? They don't make a sound. You don't know where they came from. If you're really good at writing exploits and hacking computers, no one knows you're there. You can sit and persist on a network for a decade, right? And no one ever knows. So deterrence is hard to define for me because it infers that you can do some kind of investigation, that you know it happened, right? Unless a nuclear power plant blows up, and even if it does, right? So imagine we didn't tell anyone about the Jeep hack and people's Jeeps started steering off the side of the road. You know, not that we would ever do such things because we're nice guys, but if that happened, people wouldn't say, Chris and Charlie hacked my Jeep. They'd be like, this stupid Jeep, the computer made it steer incorrectly, right? It's hard to say you're going to have deterrence when you can't definitively say that you'll ever know it happened, right? So I'm short and sweet. Those are my thoughts on this issue. And like I said, if you're good at what you do for this cyber stuff, then no one should ever know you did it.
And one thing we haven't even talked about is that there is a thriving market for exploits. Governments all over the world are buying exploits off hackers, and
I'm selling.
Yeah. If anyone is looking for some, I actually have a funny story about this. It's a sort of tragic story, but I was in Argentina last year at a hacking convention, and I met someone who sells exploits to governments or government contractors. And he was an Argentine, and I said, so, who won't you sell to? Will you only sell to the United States or American organizations? Or, and he looked at me and he said, Nicole, last time I checked, the country that bombed another country into oblivion wasn't China or Iran. And that was a big wake-up call. People have these capabilities all over the world. They can design an exploit, and they don't necessarily have the same moral compass that we might have here. So, these tools are being traded all over the world.
As David said, though, too, right? Even if you have morals and you sell it to, say, only the United States government, who's to say that isn't intercepted on the wire by someone else who doesn't share your same worldview?
Right.
It's just copies.
Yep. And just this year, we were surprised to find an NSA stockpile, apparently, of weapons that were leaked onto the web. So it's a crazy space, and it's hard to break it down. But I thought you raised a really good point, Ellie, which is with deterrence, can we even make our responses public? And we've had these situations over the last couple of years where the U.S. has vowed to do a proportional response. So with Sony Pictures, the United States specifically called out North Korea and said we will respond proportionally. With the most recent election, or the hacks of the Democratic National Committee, the U.S. government called out Russia and also said we would respond proportionally. But we don't know what those responses look like, and should those responses be made public as a deterrent to other would-be attackers? So why don't we just go down the line and tackle that one?
I think that although it's an imperfect example, I think reflecting for a second about what we have come to learn publicly about Stuxnet actually would tell us something about what is necessary to know and what is not necessary to know. I would argue that the most important aspect of Stuxnet, there are all kinds of dimensions to it, but the most important aspect of Stuxnet was to convince the Iranian leadership, number one, that they were deeply penetrated, B, that they were penetrated in ways that they had not realized before, that there were surprises that would lie on their way to make nuclear weapons if they were to decide to actually scale up the activity, accelerate it, and so on, and that there could be some unpleasant consequences if they did, and that someone cares enough about those issues to invest in such an effort so they cannot confidently rule out that there would be more severe measures that would be applied if they were to move along that path, okay? So you don't need to know all the capabilities out there. You don't need to know exactly how it's going to happen, when it's going to happen, and so on. You just need to know that you're vulnerable, that someone cares about it great enough, and that person or persons or states or whatever and so on are quite capable, creative, technologically advanced, and are able to overcome things that you thought are impossible, like overcoming the air gap, okay? I take that small example to say, I think you need to actually, all we need to do is to instill some uncertainty, not certainty, uncertainty in the adversary's mind. Number one, will he be able to conceal it? I think that the message was said here about the hacking, I don't support, because I think that yes, you may be able to conceal it if you're technically sophisticated and so on from certain forms of detection, but there are other national tools that you can employ to actually find out that some things and then start looking for that thing. And that may actually occur as a result of routine maintenance sometimes, and sometimes as a result of intelligence activity. So we instill the doubt that it won't go detected. We instill the doubt that it would go without an attribution, right? And I think there are some cases where I think you don't actually mind that the others would know or suspect, right? You just don't need to confirm it. Good enough. That you are technically capable, right? What did the Chinese do on anti-satellite weapons? Just they showed us a sample of what they're capable. It was enough to get people thinking. So I don't think you need to reveal all of your capabilities and so on, but I think from time to time there are instructive cases that people understand. And I think the most important aspect, which is where the big challenge lies, is that those occasional instances in which you demonstrate that you're in the business show measures of sophistication that were unexpected, that would actually show you that if you thought you had figured it all out, you haven't. And then you have to you have figured it all out that you won't go detected, that you won't go attributed, and you have, whether it's North Korea or whether it's Russia, and so on, and that you don't always have the resolve to respond. But occasionally, so even Mr. Putin has to think that maybe there is a 10% chance or 20% chance that even President Obama will retaliate. That may suffice, not in things you care about greatly.
Let me challenge you on one point there. Stuxnet, I agree, it instilled a lot of doubt in the Iranians' mind. But at the same time, they credit Stuxnet with the fact that they claim now that it was a huge recruiting tool, and that they claim now they have the third largest cyber army in the world. And we did see a number of attacks that seemed to be specifically retaliating against Stuxnet. On the U.S. banking system, on Saudi Aramco. So it's a questionable deterrent strategy, but it's certainly one to instill.
Well, it's a crude, we have to understand, deterrence is a crude instrument. We don't rush into using it, right? First we use the persuasion, then we use a little bit of diplomatic pressure, then we use sanctions. Those do not suffice. It's something between that and ultimately using military might, right? Or a massive covert operation that involves, actual physical destruction of. But I think if you actually understand that it fits that niche, you may say, well, that's a price worth paying, right? And the only thing is we need to be ahead of the crowd. And so, but that doesn't mean that Iran can't employ it successfully, and I think Iran has.
So I think the issue about uncertainty is really important. I think the thing to think about when you're trying to put this into a deterrence perspective is that you're doing these things in order to do something else, right? So if you are trying to keep a country from, again, it's determining what the end state is. Do I want this country to never, ever have an atomic weapon? Do I want to simply slow down the rate at which they are trying to get there? Do I want them to be able to have a, quote, commercial? Am I willing to accept that? That end state is really what all of these other techniques should be focused on. Because otherwise, what happens is when a country finds out that it has been that deeply penetrated, it is going to do certain things to hopefully ensure that that will not happen again, based on what it thinks just happened to it. So it can, and whether you believe that the MOIS has now got more recruits than it had before is probably, it could be up for discussion, but regardless, the fact is that the cyber operations from the Iranian side have gotten more widespread and more aggressive. So again, if you go back to thinking about you're trying to deter something, it's really in order to do something else, and the issue becomes, as Ali said, the issue becomes that the person that's making the decision. So the reason that the United States came so close, toe-to-toe with the Russians in the Cuban Missile Crisis is because Khrushchev did not believe that Jack Kennedy was going to pull a trigger. And when we had the final standoff with them over the ships that the cargo that was going in and out of Cuba, that convinced Khrushchev to back off. Now, what we now know is that there was another deal that was made with regard to the Jupiter missiles that were in Turkey at the time that the United States was going to do something with. But the point of that whole story is that it was an issue between what Khrushchev thought President Kennedy was or was not going to do. So again, when we talk about deterrence and we talk about deterrence things, if you have the ability to penetrate into to country X to do something against their infrastructure, that simply keeping them from getting to a particular capability might not be thinking about this quite deeply enough, that maybe we ought to be thinking further on down the road, what is the ultimate behavior that I am actually trying to change in that particular government or that particular institution or whatever it happens to be. And the demonstration of the capabilities of some of these things, you know, you would think it would have that effect. That's clearly where we got a lot of the nuclear logic from. You know, people watched the bombs at Bimini, they saw the movies from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, so there was an understanding of what could happen. In the world of cyber, you know, there have been some incidents that have occurred, but again, it's the way you portray those and put them in a context that's trying to affect someone's decision cycle and decision matrix and convincing them that you really are ready to use that and to use those weapons or to use any other weapons to respond to that is I think at the heart of this. So.
Chris, I'm going to direct this next question to you, but you know, one of the unique features of cybersecurity is that you can neuter a cyber weapon by eliminating the vulnerabilities that it needs to work. So there's a number of efforts out there now. It's becoming quite popular, and maybe some of you have contributed to some of these programs, but it's sort of become a status quo, at least among some of the biggest tech companies, that they should no longer threaten hackers or security researchers that bring up problems with their products. They should reward them. And for a long time, rewarding them meant giving them a free t-shirt or something. But now we have these very sophisticated so-called bug bounty programs that, you know, if you find a problem in your Chrome browser that allows you to do something that you're not supposed to do, and you tell Google, you'll get a sizable bug bounty. And the question is, are these, you know, Google has this program, Facebook has this program, and increasingly, I think Uber has a bug bounty program. Is this, what do you think about these programs? Do you think this is, we're actually neutering the kinds of cyber weapons that could do some form of destruction? What's your take on the bug bounty craze?
Those are complicated, but it boils down to this. I mean, there's no one solution, right? Like, if we had a perfect solution to this, someone would have done it, and we wouldn't be on here stage kind of talking about it. I think bug bounties are great, right? You can submit a bug. If someone were to say, hey, submit your bug to my program, we'll give you a t-shirt and a high five, or we're going to give you 200 large, like, it's probably an easy decision for someone who wants the money and not the fame. By the way, I was just thinking in my head about the last question. I'm sorry. That everyone talks about deterrence because they're absolute in their thoughts of attribution, but everyone's like, North Korea did the Sony thing, right? Or Russia did this. Like, no one actually knows, right? Because you always have plausible deniability. You can say it came from this IP, but who's to say you didn't bounce into that IP from 10 different other computers? So those things are hard. I'm sorry, I was thinking about that in my head when these guys were talking. So it's one of the things where you always can say, oh, it wasn't me, because you can always say, like, well, someone hacked me and bounce it from there. So attribution's hard. But for bug bounties, that assumes that there's a finite amount of bugs and they'll one day not exist, but that's not true. We write new software, we're humans, we make mistakes, we're bad at writing secure code. History's proven that, so they're good because you get people to help you out, but you're depending on the kindness of strangers to help you out.
Could I just make a quick, you You just talked about the attribution piece, and we've been kind of sniffing around that a little bit today. And everything you said is absolutely correct, as you know. One of the things that you might think about is if attribution is going to become such a central part of the way that we are going to try to develop a cyber deterrence strategy that's executable, then we might want to think about technical ways that you can sort of a priori enter into certain systems so that you will have a greater level of confidence in where that attack has come from, which would mean that you would now begin to look at particular actors around the world and say that actor is, for all these various reasons, someone that we are very concerned about. And now you're getting into a realm of law and policy and the ethical issues that were raised earlier today about where do you cross that line? You know, we don't have, for instance, a very established line that says that is an act of war in cyberspace. When again, someone mentioned Estonia earlier. So, you know, one of the things about that was they went to ask for an Article 5 by NATO, an attack on one is an attack on us all, and it was not approved. That's not really an attack, and in spite of the fact that you could argue they took down the entire defense ministry and most of the other major government organizations in Estonia for some period of time. So what that attack is, and again, when you talk about an attack against another country, we have rules in the world today about overflight of countries, right? So if I'm going to overfly country X to go drop a bomb on country Y, I've violated their sovereign airspace. So tell me how that applies in the world of cyber. You know, I got this little guy in his router, and he's making decisions on where to send packets. That he doesn't know anything about international relations. He doesn't know what the Treaty of Westphalia was. He's got no idea what this is, right? Or she, depending on who it is, and off goes this little packet. Well, if that little packet crosses country X, have I violated its sovereignty if it goes through a server there? Even if the country that owns the doesn't even know, as you just said, that it's even been there? So those kinds of questions, I think, require us to think very, very strongly about preemption, wrong word, about our footprint in other places that would allow us a higher level of confidence sooner about where these attacks might have come from and what might have caused them.
If I may, two quick points. One is on the attribution. We're dealing with an iterative process. You're getting better at this. The other side is getting better at trying to defeat your attribution, in part by privateering. I guess Tim will address that issue later. So we're challenged there. It's dynamic. But I think the other thing to understand is I think intelligence attribution has gotten a lot better by the key players, a great deal better. It's no coincidence that the US has come out with confidence saying these guys are behind it and so on. We can't be sure that President Putin given the instruction, but we can be sure that the Russian government is behind that operation. And that is notwithstanding the certificate. By the way, they may not even try that hard to deny it, but that's in some of those cases and so on. The other thing is just to, I think the good way of turning to the audience is to say, look, we've talked a lot about deterrence and the crude instrument that it is. We need to understand that deterrence is also a reassurance tool and that it's part of a strategy of offering an alternative. And I think we have here someone who has been at the forefront of diplomacy with Iran. So on the one hand, you deter them from going there. On the other hand, you reassure them that if they don't do certain things, you won't attack them. And with the other hand, you actually offer them an alternative. That's the only way in which deterrence can be an effective strategy. So we need to understand that deterrence doesn't stand just on its own feet. It actually has to be accompanied by a comprehensive strategy.
Let's stick with the recent Russian election hacks. You know, from a reporter standpoint, this was one of the most frustrating stories to cover for On My Beat of the year because the attribution actually was better than most of the major attacks that I have covered. And people came forward with great confidence and said, we know it was these two well-known actors. We know that they are part of the Russian intelligence service. And even then, the amount of hate mail and death threats and Twitter trolling I got were just really outsized. And I think some of them were probably the Russian troll army. But we were very confident that it was these two Russian actors that had hacked into the DNC, for example. and we have vowed a proportional response, but what does that response look like? Is it even in the cyber realm? You know, what do? We promise to go hack into the next.
I don't know. I mean, you know, if George and his brother showed up in the middle of the night and drug those guys off to Siberia somewhere, what I was saying is that there are ways to deal with that I think, and we've been talking about this, that we need to think about beyond just the cyber realm. And there are other ways to influence people's activities, potentially in a more forthright manner that might have an immediate effect on what they're doing or not doing. But,
I think you're using the term know when you mean speculate, right? We know it was Russians. You don't know. You speculate that it was them. Like when you hack stuff, you're not going to do it from your house, right? You're going to bounce off a few things, and you may play a game where it's like, oh, I pretend to be Russian all the time. That's hilarious because no one will think I'm American or, you know, English or whatever. So people like to use definitive terms like, no, we know it was this. No, you speculate that it was that. And yes, there's a bunch of hints that it you know, originated in Russia, but there's no definitive statement or evidence that can be proven to say it actually came from there. I mean, obviously, I'm not in the intelligence community, so I don't know. There could be out-of-band communications where they explicitly sent an email. It's like, yep, that was us. But you know, if you don't have that information, you can't say no. You just have to say speculate.
One of the most complicating factors for deterrence here is it's not as if the state manages most of our critical infrastructure. Much of that is managed by the private sector. And there have been efforts to try and make those systems more resilient to a cyber attack and to do programs such as cyber threat sharing. But for the most part, the private sector has been pretty resistant to some of these efforts. How do you think we go about even trying to make these systems more resilient and defend against attacks when so much of them, as you probably know, Chris, are using these old legacy software systems that are just riddled with vulnerabilities and open to attack?
So part of it, I think, at least in my experience, part of the issue has been cultural. It's had to do with the sharing of information, and because there's actually there's a lot of information in the private sector about what's happening out there, that if you were to couple that with a lot of the information that is available to the government, you might find a much more complete picture of what you're trying to do. But again, there's some legal issues, there's some cultural issues that keep that from happening. The other part of it is the incentivization. So if I'm a commercial company and I'm going to spend lots and lots of money to harden my networks, you know, kind of what's in it for me, even though someone said, well, you're part of the critical infrastructure. And that leads you to another big discussion, which is what is the role of the U.S. government? We've now designated certain parts of our infrastructure as critical. So now that that's happened, what is the role of the government? What's the role of the Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security in ensuring that critical infrastructure is protected in ways that at a higher level potentially than it is today? The thing about trying to figure out exactly who the bad guys are, who the people were that penetrated, for instance, the DNC, you know, that might lead you to look at this from the other standpoint, which is what is it about the network that we're using here in the DNC about our that made it vulnerable in that, and I got it that that's one part of it, but there's passive and active ways to go about trying to defend that, because you can't defend everywhere. It's not possible.
Yeah, I really think you're hit the nail on the head with incentivization, because in technology, you tend to go with if it's not broke, don't fix it, right? There's a reason that you go check in for your airline, it takes forever, because it's a front end to some 50-year-old mainframe, and the reason they didn't update it wasn't because they didn't care about cybersecurity, it's because they have this system that needs to run day in, day out with, 4 nines uptime, and they can't really take the time. They're not incentivized to say, hey, we're taking a day off to upgrade all of our systems, right? So it's hard. They provide a service, We want it to be secure, but their business isn't being secure. Their business is providing that service.
But I just want to caution us against expecting the government to do the heavy beating. Can't we think of the private sector and even individuals and NGO playing a role here of incentivizing? We are working with the insurance industry, right? The insurance industry could be the de facto regulator. Naming and shaming is an important tool, right? The role of the media in that respect, and litigation. So we need to think creatively. I mean, the government is going to shrink, presumably, in the next couple of years. And clearly won't want to place an even tighter hand in regulation, and corporations are resisting it. But when an insurance company comes to you and says, look, you want insurance for cyber? Here is what we expect you to do. Otherwise, you'll be sued for having produced a flawed product or offering a service that is proven unreliable. So let's not rely just exclusively on governments.
So just 30 seconds. So the issue about the insurance thing is really interesting. If you think about what happened with the quote tanker wars in the 80s during the Gulf of Hormuz situation, when we reflagged the Kuwaiti tankers and began to escort them, it was part of that had to do with the fact that the Lloyd's of London insurance rates for those tankers had exceeded the rate that any of the companies could afford to pay for them to move through the Gulf, and yet in the bigger scheme of life, moving that oil, continuing to move that oil became important enough that there was actually something that was done from a national security perspective but it was all driven by the rates that Lloyd's began to charge for these, for the ships that move through there. So.
We're going to open this up to audience questions. So if you have a question, just raise your hand over there. Go ahead.
I was wondering what the participants' thoughts were on the conventional acceptance of things like collateral damage and the delineation between combatants and non-combatants and proxy combatants, and how that translates into the cyber domain.
About the last part of the question about collateral damage, is that?
Yes. So if there was a retaliatory strike, what would be the acceptable level of collateral damage if it was through the cyber domain? And how would you delineate between non-combatants and combatants?
That is a great question, and it's one that is very, very difficult to answer, quite frankly, and it's one that causes senior policymakers a lot of angst, decision makers, because again, if you're going to respond, or if you're going to do something, one of the first questions that you get asked is, so how confident are we that we can contain those effects in a particular network, in a particular geographic area, name whatever the constraint is. And that becomes difficult. And it becomes difficult depending on what you're trying to do or how you're trying to respond, because you don't know what you don't know sometimes. And just someone merely patching parts of a network will cause an effect or will cause something to occur outside of where you hoped it would. The other thing to consider in terms of the collateral damage piece is, so if I decide that I want to turn the lights out in parts of country X because they have a weapons program that I'm concerned about, the first question that somebody's going to ask you is, so how confident are you that you're not going to turn the power off to all the hospitals out there and that people are going to start dying because of this, even though it's just tangentially connected to that network? What level of confidence can you give me? And that is a difficult thing, and it's more difficult sometimes when you think about the kinetic world. Right now, I drop a GPS-guided bomb. I can tell you within 2 feet where that thing's going to land, and I've got graphs and things that'll show you just exactly what the effect is going to be. So it's easy to kind of contain that and put that in a box for a decision maker to say, if I make this decision, that's about the effect I'm going to have. And you do that, as you can imagine, in the cyber world, it might not be quite so easy. And that angst is both on the offensive side and on the defensive reactions that you might employ.
Talked about attribution today. The point that I wanted to share was that the internet is decentralized, right? And there are a lot of ISPs that are present on the internet. How can a policy from one government, even if you develop a solution which provides attribution, like if we want to put these into the routers, how does a policy by one government control this entire internet to be able to provide this kind of an attribution on the internet?
That might be for you, Ellie, or for our next panel.
Well, first of all, I think we should refer to the next panel, and I think particularly to and to the keynote speaker, because I think there is an effort to harmonize standards. There are efforts to harmonize policies and so on, which use multi-stakeholders initiatives, and Fadi will talk about some of his own experience, pioneering experience in doing that. I think there is a lot of issue of which venue you actually use. Is the ITU the right one? Is ICANN the right one? I mean, we can discuss that at some length. I think that one has to be extremely creative here, and what we, in our modest niche that we're working on are trying to do is saying, okay, one advantage of working with insurance, they're global. They can harmonize. But another way of looking at it, saying, okay, if Apple on its operating system, and Google on Android, and Microsoft on Windows are all operating in ways that conform to certain standards, don't we limit the space, the operating space? They just have to conform to the same principles of how they actually go about it, and so on, because they create the global platform, in essence. And we can go around and trying to say, okay, who are the shapers? And in most of these cases, there aren't many of those. Okay? We talk to the giants, and we try to create some kind of collaboration among them. How many companies are offering, big companies are offering cloud services? There aren't that many of those. So and that's what we're trying to do, to find those champions and say, okay, some of them don't want to be seen collaborating with each other. There are all kinds of antitrust issues you have to overcome, but that's the kind of stuff that we've been trying to do.
But that can stifle innovation, right? If you're saying everyone needs to conform to the same standard.
No, not standards. Okay. A few ethical and core principles, not standard. Definitely not stifling the innovation.
I think that's splitting hairs, though. Like, you could say it's core ethical standards, and then other person would argue that you're trying to hold them back because they want to innovate.
Well, that's why it's a debate, and it's a dynamic one. I'm not talking about treaties.
One of the most interesting things I found covering cybersecurity from Silicon Valley is just how much collaboration there is just within the security teams at the big companies, particularly Google, and you probably see some of this too, even at Uber. But there is a large degree of threat sharing, but I do think it becomes complicated when you talk about entering markets like China. Which companies are going to agree to abide by censorship rules and which aren't?
So, yeah, and two of the countries that have been the biggest proponents for cyber norms, of course, have been Russia and China, and the irony is not lost on a lot of people. But so if you think about it at a very fundamental level, this is just my opinion. We in the United States look at the internet as a thing unto itself. It was created, it came about because of the need for collaboration, and it is an entity that exists that is separate from the government, it is separate from everything else. It is just, it's a thing in itself, to quote Husserl. But in Russia and in China, I would suggest, they look at the internet as something that the government owns. It is a way that the government exercises its right to do things. It's simply another tool in their toolkit of foreign policy and domestic surveillance and repression and whatever else. But it's different because it's part of what the state is and has. So they don't see any contradiction with the fact that they throttle some of the websites, or that they have rules that call for what is it called? Lawful something, something, something in Russia. They have an expression for it that basically says you are committing to being monitored by other people all the time, because that's just the way they view it. And it's just a very fundamental thing. We look at it very, very differently from here. And I think that's one of the cultural clashes you're seeing as we try to come to any agreement that has any hope of acceptance across the community. So.
Another interesting factor here is that in the United States, some of the big tech companies have become tools in some of these cyber weapons. So the one that immediately comes to mind was there was a major virus found in Iran called Flame, And the way that it entered some of these systems was to basically mimic the Microsoft software update mechanism. And so Microsoft basically realized they'd been used as a tool for presumably, possibly the US government to infiltrate computers in Iran. And I just remember that weekend, Microsoft security team was hunkered down over a 3-day holiday weekend trying to fix this hole that some government had used to attack another nation state. And so I think Silicon Valley companies in particular are really craving some kind of international norms for what's acceptable and what's unacceptable in matters of cyber war. So I think we just have time for one last question. Go ahead.
My question is regarding the bug bounty program. So we have a bug bounty program and we have something called responsible disclosure. So if we found a bug, we just let it out to the world that, okay, here's a bug. And then we deter them. Okay, so here's one way to attack you, attack us, but don't attack us. So how does that really make sense? Like, how do you actually, deterrence, how does it actually make sense over here?
Well, I mean, to me, responsible disclosure means nothing. It's your bug. You found it. You can do what you want. It's art. Publish it on the internet, give it to someone, wait for them. The reason that you have a bug bounty is it incentivizes you to not just dump it on the internet, right? We'll give you $500 if you give it to us and play by our rules. So I think a lot of bug bounty programs were just kind of invented to incentivize people to play to your disclosure rules as opposed to having it be a free-for-all. So that's kind of what I think about bug bounties in general.
I think that's it. So thank you so much to our panelists here, and thanks for your questions. And we'll be around during lunch and hope to meet some of you.
Another big round of applause for our moderator and panelists. Wonderful job. We're going to now take a short break, and we'll reconvene at 11 o'clock. Thank you.